Greetings, quiet listeners. In our tale tonight, it is not an empire that falls, but a mountain that rises to cast a shadow over the entire globe. We journey to 1815, a year that felt like the end of days, not due to war, but to the colossal eruption of Mount Tambora. Imagine the sun vanishing and a chilling cold descending in the heart of summer. If this quiet dive into a global chill captures your attention, consider a gentle like. It helps us continue these expeditions. As we settle in, where are you listening from? Now, pull your blanket closer as we explore nature's silent, devastating power. On the island of Sumbawa, in modern-day Indonesia, stood the quiet sentinel of Mount Tambora. Before 1815, it rose to a majestic 4,300 meters, or 14,000 feet, one of the tallest peaks in the archipelago. Its slopes were fertile, covered in lush forests, and home to small villages. The people of local kingdoms lived in its shadow, their lives following peaceful rhythm of the seasons. They were completely unaware that their peaceful mountain was a slumbering giant, holding immense destructive power in its core, waiting for the moment to awaken from its long and silent rest. The mountain had stirred before. For 3 years the ground would occasionally tremble and small plumes of steam would rise from its crater. These were whispers of the immense pressure building deep within the earth. To the local inhabitants, these were not seen as dire omens, but as the mountain simply breathing, a common occurrence in this volatile part of the world. They grew accustomed to the occasional tremor, but these were not idle sighs. They were the strained breaths of a sealed magma chamber, supercharged with gas approaching a critical, explosive point. On the evening of April 10, 1815, the whispers became a definitive, world-shattering roar. A series of colossal explosions tore the mountain apart. The sound was incomprehensible, the loudest single event in all of recorded history. It was not a local phenomenon. On the island of Sumatra, over 2,600 kilometers away, officials mistook the sound for distant cannon fire, dispatching troops to investigate a phantom battle. The concussive force was a physical blow that announced an event of planetary significance, though its source remained a mystery. Near Tambora, the world was plunged into absolute darkness. A towering column of ash and gas surged into the stratosphere, reaching an altitude of more than 40 kilometers. As this colossal umbrella of debris spread, it blotted out the sun completely. For 3 full days, a region over 600 kilometers wide was enveloped in a blackness deeper than any night. Flaming hot pyroclastic flows, avalanches of gas and rock, raced down the slopes at truly impossible speeds, incinerating everything in their path and wiping terrifying kingdoms from existence. Scientists classify such events using the Volcanic Explosivity Index, or VEI. The famous 1980 Mount St. Helens eruption was a VEI 5. So was the destruction of Pompeii. Tambora's 1815 eruption registered as a VEI 7, denoting power of an almost unimaginable scale. It ejected over 150 cubic kilometers of pulverized rock and ash into the atmosphere, releasing energy equal to thousands of nuclear weapons. The mountain, once 14,000 feet tall, was decapitated by the blast, losing over a vertical kilometer of its height. Yet for all its apocalyptic fury, the Tambora eruption remains a strangely forgotten cataclysm. A primary reason is its remoteness from the centers of Western power and communication in the 19th century. News traveled at the speed of a sailing ship, and initial reports were fragmented, confused, and easily dismissed as exaggeration. Without telegraphs or global news networks to instantly convey the horror, the story arrived in Europe and North America in scattered pieces months after the event. It lacked the context to truly shock the public consciousness. Furthermore, the world of 1815 had its attention fixed firmly elsewhere. In Europe, the dominant story was of a returning emperor. Napoleon Bonaparte had escaped his exile on Elba and was marching across France to reclaim his power. The great nations of Europe were mobilizing their armies for a final confrontation. The minds of statesmen, generals, and the public were consumed with this human drama. The rumbles from Tambora were drowned out by the drums of war, which would culminate 2 months later in the Battle of Waterloo, an event that seized the historical narrative. The sound heard across the ocean, and the flows that erased entire cultures were, in the grand scheme, just the prelude. The eruption was more than a bang. It was a profound chemical change to Earth's atmosphere. The real, enduring, and global impact of Tambora was not in the sound it made, but in the eerie silence that followed. It came as a vast, sunlight-blocking veil of sulfur dioxide injected into the stratosphere. This veil would soon stretch across the planet, silently heralding a period of climate chaos, famine, and disease that the world was utterly unprepared to face. For many centuries, Mount Tambora is a foundation of life. It was a silent giant, a constant presence for the people of Sumbawa. Its formidable peak, veiled in a crown of clouds, was a provider. The rich volcanic soil blanketed its slopes, sustaining generations and allowing for lush forests and fertile fields. The kingdoms of Tambora, Pekat, and Senga flourished in its shadow, their cultures woven into the existence of the dormant mountain that gave their land its very shape. The memory of its last eruption was lost to time, buried under ancient earth. It had slumbered for so long that its volcanic nature was more geology than lived reality. Children played on its lower slopes, villages were built in its protective reach, and its forests provided food and medicine. Tambora was simply there, as permanent as the sea. Its long silence was taken not as a warning, but as a promise of eternal peace and stability. This long silent promise was first broken in 1812. The initial stirrings were subtle. It began not with a bang, but with a deep, resonant hum from the marrow of the earth. It was a vibration felt more in the bones than heard with the ears. Villagers would pause, looking at one another with questioning eyes. Was it a distant tremor from the sea? The sound was so low and profound its source was impossible to pinpoint. It was a faint, unsettling whisper from a mountain that had not spoken for an age. These early tremors were infrequent, coming and going like a fleeting thought. Days or weeks would pass in silence, allowing the brief moments of unease to be dismissed as imagination. Life would return to its familiar rhythm and the mountain would stand impassively against the sky. Yet, the memory of that deep vibration lingered. A seed of apprehension had been planted. The certainty of the mountain's permanence had for the first time in centuries been gently questioned by the land itself. As the months of 1812 wore on, the tremors became more frequent, more insistent. They were no longer isolated incidents but formed a subtle, sporadic pattern. The animals, with their keener senses, were the first to show persistent distress. Birds would take flight in sudden, panicked flocks for no apparent reason. Livestock in the fields grew skittish and agitated, their lowing carrying a note of anxiety. The wild creatures of the forest grew silent or moved to lower ground, away from the disquiet emanating from Tambora's core. By 1813, the mountain's stirrings had become an unsettling part of life. The people of Sumbawa began to speak of the mountain in hushed tones. Was the great peak simply turning in its sleep, or was something more significant taking place within its hidden depths? Elders looked to the summit, their faces etched with a worry they could not fully articulate. They searched for signs in the sky, in the sea, and in the wind, trying to decipher the mountain's strange new language of vibrations and deep, guttural groans. The ground beneath their feet, once a symbol of stability, now felt untrustworthy. A fine tremor might run through a home in the middle of a meal, causing water to tremble in a cup. At night, the deep rumbling would sometimes weave its way into their dreams. This slow, creeping anxiety became a constant companion. The mountain was no longer just a feature of the landscape. It had become an active presence, a brooding entity whose intentions were unclear and whose power was a terrifying unknown quantity. The situation began to escalate as 1814 turned into 1815. The character of the warning started to change. It was no longer just a feeling or a sound. It was now something that could be seen. From the once serene crater at Tambora's summit, a thin, persistent plume of steam began to rise. It was a pale white column against the azure sky, a clear and undeniable signal that the heat within the mountain was growing and finding its way to the surface. The giant was not just stirring now, it was visibly beginning to breathe. Soon the white steam was joined by something darker. Wisps of gray and black ash began to mix with the plume, staining the sky. On days when the wind was still, a fine, gritty powder would drift down, lightly coating leaves and rooftops in the nearest villages. It was a ghostly touch, turning the vibrant green of the jungle into a muted gray. The air, once clean, began to carry a faint but sharp, acrid smell. It was the scent of sulfur, the unmistakable odor of volcanic unrest, a chemical confirmation of their deepest fears. This visual and olfactory evidence changed everything. The abstract fear born of rumbles now had a physical manifestation. The mountain was actively ejecting parts of its inner self into their world. The light dustings of ash were a tangible warning, a direct message. Each morning, people would look to the summit with a new sense of dread. The question was no longer if the mountain was waking up, but what it would do now that it was awake. The quiet apprehension of the past years sharpened into a palpable sense of danger. The first true explosion occurred on the evening of April 5, 1815. It was a sudden, violent escalation that shattered the tense quiet. Without further warning, a thunderous detonation erupted from the summit. It was not yet the cataclysmic roar to come, but it was powerful enough to be heard for hundreds of kilometers. It was a sharp, guttural blast announcing a new and more dangerous phase. For the people on the island, it was a moment of pure terror. The sound their subconscious had been dreading for years, finally made real. Immediately following the blast, a formidable column of fire and ash shot upwards from the crater, reaching a height of several kilometers. It was a terrifying spectacle, a pillar of churning darkness and glowing embers against the twilight sky. The eruption continued for several hours, a continuous, deafening roar replacing the intermittent rumbles of the past. The sky, which had only been lightly hazed before, now grew thick with falling material. The air became heavy and difficult to breathe, filled with the choking scent of sulfur. Small stones and pieces of light, porous rock known as pumice began to rain down upon the slopes and nearby villages. It was not just a light dusting anymore. This was a steady fall of volcanic debris, clattering onto rooftops and pathways. It was a direct assault from the mountain. Panic began to take hold. Families huddled in their homes, the sound of the roaring mountain and the pelting of pumice, a terrifying symphony of destruction. The long, slow awakening was over, the storm had arrived, and this was its opening salvo. For the next 5 days, from April 5th to April 10th, an uneasy and terrifying lull descended. The initial violent eruption subsided, but the mountain did not return to sleep. Instead, it remained menacingly active. The thunderous roar softened to a deep, continuous grumble, like a predator pacing in its lair. The column of ash, though less violent, continued to billow from the summit, casting a permanent, gloomy pall over the sky. Sunlight struggled to pierce the haze, casting the island in a perpetual twilight. The rain of pumice and ash ceased its initial intensity, but did not stop completely. A light, constant shower of fine gray particles continued to fall, a persistent reminder of the mountain's power and instability. The world was now coated in a layer of gray. The rivers ran murky with volcanic silt, and the once vibrant foliage drooped under the weight of the gritty dust. The air remained thick and acrid. The people waited, trapped between the first blast and the profound feeling that something worse was yet to come. This period was perhaps the most psychologically harrowing. It was a state of suspended terror. The immediate danger had passed, but the threat felt more immense than ever. Every tremor of the earth, every fresh plume of smoke from the summit was a potential prelude to the final devastating event. They watched the sky, they listened to the groans of the earth. They lived in the shadow of a visibly angry giant, caught in the deep, anxious breath it was taking before its ultimate, world-altering roar. The calm was not peaceful, it was a drawn bowstring. The 5th day of the uneasy lull, April 10, 1815, settled into a gloomy evening. The sun, a pale and sickly disk behind a persistent volcanic haze, had set without ceremony. On the island of Sumbawa, the world was already a monochrome landscape of gray ash from the eruption 5 days prior. The air was thick, heavy with the smell of sulfur and the fine, gritty dust that coated every surface. People remained in their homes or gathered in small, anxious groups, their eyes fixed on the menacing silhouette of the mountain against the darkening sky. The continuous deep grumble from its peak was a constant, unnerving reminder of the power simmering just beneath the surface. This was a world holding its breath. The initial panic from the first explosion had subsided into a state of profound dread. Every family knew the mountain was not finished. The question that hung unspoken in the thick air was not if, but when the true fury would be unleashed. The animals were silent, the birds had vanished, and an unnatural quiet, punctuated only by the mountain's threatening growl, enveloped the island. It was the final fleeting moment of a world that was, in a matter of minutes, about to be completely and utterly erased from existence. A final pause before the symphony of destruction began in earnest. At approximately 7 o'clock in the evening, the waiting ended. The mountain ruptured. It began with a single, deafening detonation that was not so much a sound as it was a physical blow to reality. It was a sharp, explosive crack that dwarfed the blast from 5 days earlier, a sound that seemed to tear the very fabric of the sky. This was immediately followed by 2 more colossal explosions in quick succession. The mountain, which had stood for millennia, was tearing itself apart. The immense pressure that had built up for centuries was released in a few terrifying, cataclysmic moments of geological fury. For those on the island, the sound was beyond comprehension. It was a force that flattened homes and stripped trees of their leaves and branches instantly. A violent pressure wave, a shock wave of immense power, radiated outwards from the summit, turning the lush, forested slopes into a barren, splintered wasteland in the blink of an eye. The ground heaved violently, not in tremors, but in great rolling waves, as if the solid earth had turned to liquid. All sense of stability was gone, replaced by a chaotic and deafening violence that signaled the end of everything. This was the beginning of the roar heard round the world. The sound waves, traveling through the atmosphere, began their long journey across the sea. In Batavia, the capital of the Dutch East Indies, now modern-day Jakarta, some 1,260 kilometers away, the explosions were distinctly heard. Officials and residents were startled by what they believed to be the sound of intense cannon fire. They were so convinced of an attack that they spent the evening in a state of high alert, searching the horizon for enemy ships that did not exist, their attention fixed on a phantom human conflict. Even further away, the sound maintained its terrifying clarity. On the island of Sumatra, an astonishing 2,600 kilometers from Tambora, the detonations were heard so clearly that the British Lieutenant Governor, Sir Stamford Raffles, mistook them for a military engagement. Believing a nearby fort was under attack or that pirates were engaging a ship, he dispatched 2 colonial vessels to investigate the source of the cannonade. But the sound carried with such fidelity that it was interpreted not as a natural event, but as a deliberate act of human aggression. The acoustic disturbance was of a planetary scale. Reports of mysterious, thunderous noises came from across the region. In some places it was a low, continuous rumble that lasted for hours, causing windows to vibrate and locals to look to the skies in confusion and fear. In others, it was a series of sharp reports, like distant artillery. For thousands of kilometers in every direction, the death of Mount Tambora announced itself as a profound and inexplicable mystery, a sound from an unknown source that unsettled all who heard its passage through the night. Back on Sumbawa, the source of the sound was undertaking a terrible transformation. The very peak of the mountain, over a vertical kilometer of solid rock, was obliterated. In its place, a churning, incandescent mass of molten rock and superheated gas began to surge upwards. This was the birth of the main eruption column, a colossal pillar of blackness that punched its way through the atmosphere with unimaginable force. Was the mountain unmaking itself, ejecting its own substance into the highest reaches of the sky, in a final, furious act? The column ascended at a tremendous speed, a turbulent, roiling tower of ash and pulverized rock. It rose higher and higher, through the troposphere where all weather occurs, and continued its relentless climb deep into the serene, frozen calm of the stratosphere. It eventually reached a staggering altitude of more than 43 kilometers, or about 27 miles. At this height, the upper atmospheric winds began to catch the plume, shearing its top and beginning the process of spreading a veil of debris across the entire planet. Within this monstrous column of black ash, a terrifying secondary phenomenon was taking place. The friction between billions of fast-moving ash particles generated immense amounts of static electricity. This energy was discharged in colossal bolts of lightning that arced and flashed within the plume itself. Observers from a distance described a terrifying spectacle, a black cloud that produced its own continuous, silent lightning storm. This was a dirty thunderstorm, a maelstrom of electricity contained entirely within the erupting, volcanic cloud. As the column raged upwards, a far more lethal force was unleashed at its base. The column could not support its own immense weight, and parts of it began to collapse back down upon the mountain. This generated pyroclastic flows, superheated, fast-moving avalanches of gas, ash, and rock. They were not slow-moving lava, they were fluid, turbulent currents that moved like a liquid, hugging the ground and racing down the mountain's slopes at speeds of several hundred kilometers per hour, hotter than an oven. These flows were the primary agent of destruction. They moved with an unstoppable, terrifying momentum, a dense gray wave of incineration. Everything in their path was instantly and utterly destroyed. The forests on the mountain slopes were not burned, they were vaporized, the trees carbonized and blown apart in an instant. The very soil was sterilized by the intense heat. The hissing, roaring sound of the advancing flows was the last thing any living creature in its path would have ever heard. The kingdom of Tambora, situated on the slopes of the mountain, was the first to vanish. The thousands of people who called it home, the villages they had built, the fields they had cultivated, all were consumed by the pyroclastic flows in a matter of minutes. There was no time to run, no place to hide. The destruction was absolute and instantaneous. The flow passed over the kingdom, and when it was gone, there was nothing left but a flat, smoldering plain of gray ash, where a vibrant culture had existed just moments before. The neighboring kingdom of Pekat, on the opposite side of the peninsula, met the same fate. The pyroclastic flows, unconstrained by topography, spread out from the mountain in every direction, a radiating wave of death. Pekat and all of its inhabitants were wiped from the face of the earth, buried under meters of hot ash and pumice. In less than an hour, an estimated 12,000 people from these two kingdoms were killed, their world entirely and completely annihilated by the mountain that had once sustained them. As the eruption continued its furious work, the massive umbrella of the ash cloud spread, blotting out the stars and the moon. A profound darkness fell over Sumbawa and the surrounding islands, a blackness more complete than anything imaginable. It was a darkness devoid of all light, a sensory deprivation so total that people reported not being able to see their own hands in front of their faces, even with a lamp. This supernatural night would last for 3 full days, a sunless world shrouded in a thick, choking blanket of ash. This was not simply the absence of light, it was an active, oppressive presence. The air was thick with falling ash, making breathing difficult and painful. The constant rain of fine, gritty particles, along with small stones of pumice, created a continuous, soft, rustling sound. The world was reduced to a state of blindness and suffocation, a terrifying, claustrophobic existence where the only sensations were the feel of grit on the skin, the struggle for breath, and the unending, profound darkness that had swallowed the world. The sea itself was transformed. As the pyroclastic flows hit the coast, they flash-boiled the water and deposited immense quantities of pumice, a volcanic rock so light it floats. The surface of the ocean for kilometers around Sumbawa became choked with vast floating rafts of this gray rock, some of them several meters thick. These pumice rafts were so extensive that they formed a kind of temporary shifting landmass, making ship navigation utterly impossible for months after the eruption. The violence of the pyroclastic flows crashing into the ocean also generated a series of tsunamis. These were not singular, massive waves, but a chaotic surge of water that battered the coasts of Sumbawa and the neighboring islands of Lombok and Bali. Coastal villages that had been spared the direct wrath of the flows were now inundated by the sea, adding another layer of destruction to the unfolding cataclysm. The mountain was attacking the land, the air, and now the sea itself, leaving no avenue of escape. When the main paroxysm of the eruption finally subsided, the mountain that remained was a shadow of its former self. Where the majestic 14,000-foot peak once stood, there was now a vast, gaping hole. The eruption had created a caldera, a massive volcanic crater, more than 6 kilometers wide and over a kilometer deep. The entire top of the mountain was gone, having been violently ejected into the stratosphere. The island's geography had been permanently and irrevocably altered in a single night of unimaginable violence. In the days that followed, the scene was one of utter desolation. The ruined mountain stood smoking, its new vast crater steaming under a sky still gray with ash. The surrounding landscape was a sterile, silent desert of pumice and hardened ash, devoid of any sign of life. The roar had faded, replaced by an eerie, profound silence. The main event was over, but its consequences, carried on the high winds in the silent stratospheric veil, were only just beginning to unfold for the rest of the unsuspecting world. When the final, cataclysmic roar of Mount Tambora faded, it was replaced by a profound and unsettling silence. The island of Sumbawa, once a vibrant tapestry of green forests and thriving kingdoms, had been transformed into a sterile, alien landscape. The world was now a uniform shade of gray, buried under a thick, suffocating blanket of hot ash and pumice. The sky itself remained a ceiling of darkness, a featureless void from which a constant, gentle rain of fine volcanic dust continued to fall, coating the new desert in a fresh layer of ruin. This was not the aftermath of a storm, it was the creation of a new, dead world. The agents of this instant transformation were the pyroclastic flows. These were not mere rivers of lava, but dense, superheated clouds of gas and debris that had scoured the land. Where they had passed, nothing remained. They had filled in valleys, flattened hills, and created a new, smoother topography of death. The deposits they left behind were meters thick, a complex layer of ash, rock, and pumice that had buried everything that had once stood on the island. The land itself was gone, replaced by the mountain's own ejected substance. For days and weeks after the eruption, this new landscape remained intensely hot. The thick pyroclastic deposits held their heat, making the ground itself a deadly hazard. Water that trickled into these deposits would have instantly flashed into steam, creating dangerous pockets of scalding vapor. The ground itself would have been too hot to walk on, a vast, smoldering plain. Any survivors who had somehow weathered the initial blast would have found themselves trapped in a desolate, burning environment with no shelter and no escape from the relentless heat radiating from below. This was a burial, not just a destruction. The pyroclastic flows had entombed the kingdoms of Tambora and Peket so completely that they were effectively lost to history. Their villages, their people, and all traces of their culture vanished beneath the hot gray blanket. For more than a century and a half, their exact locations were a mystery, their names relegated to footnotes in obscure colonial records. The annihilation was so absolute that it was as if they had simply been lifted from the face of the earth, leaving no trace of their existence behind. It was not until the late 20th and early 21st centuries that archaeologists, following old maps and records, began to uncover what lay beneath the ash. In an astonishing discovery, they found preserved remains of a home, its occupants and their belongings, frozen in time at the moment that pyroclastic flows struck. This site, now known as the Pompeii of the East, provided a haunting, singular glimpse into a culture that was entirely wiped out in a single night, a testament to the instantaneous and total nature of the devastation. Beyond the reach of the pyroclastic flows, the primary instrument of destruction was the ash itself. The sheer volume of material ejected from the volcano was staggering, and it all had to come down somewhere. Sumbawa and the neighboring islands of Lombok and Bali were inundated. It was not a light dusting, but a heavy, suffocating deluge. The weight of this wet, dense ash was immense, and it proved fatal for any structure that had managed to withstand the initial shockwaves of the eruption. Roofs that had stood for generations began to groan under the unfamiliar load. The constant, fine rain of ash slowly accumulated, becoming heavier and more compact. Eventually, the strain became too much, and across the islands, homes and shelters began to collapse. Families who had sought refuge indoors found themselves in a new kind of trap, crushed by the very structures meant to protect them. This slow, silent destruction by weight added another layer of tragedy to the cataclysm. The ash did more than just crush, it smothered. It was composed of fine, sharp shards of volcanic glass and pulverized rock. When inhaled, it was ruinous to the lungs of any surviving person or animal. It blanketed agricultural fields, burying crops under a thick, sterile layer that would prevent anything from growing for years to come. The vibrant green of the landscape, the source of all food, was gone, replaced by a gray poison that would ensure starvation for those who had survived the eruption itself. Rivers and streams, the sources of fresh water, were choked with this sediment. They became thick, muddy torrents of ash and water, undrinkable and useless for irrigation. The delicate ecosystem of the entire region was shattered. Fish in the rivers died, livestock that ate the ash-covered vegetation perished, and the very foundation of life was systematically dismantled. The ashfall was a slow, quiet killer, ensuring that the immediate violence of the eruption would be followed by a long and brutal period of famine and disease. The 3 days of absolute darkness compounded the horror. With no sun or moon, disorientation was total. The world was reduced to what could be touched, a claustrophobic existence in a choking, gritty fog. For the survivors, these days were a period of profound psychological trauma. Isolated and blind, with the sounds of collapsing roofs and the groans of the dying around them, it would have truly felt as though the world had ended, that the sun was extinguished forever, and that they were the last souls left in a dead, dark universe. This period of blackness was a turning point. It marked the transition from the shock of the eruption to the grim reality of its consequences. When the sky finally began to lighten on the 4th day, it did not reveal a scene of hope. Instead, the pale, hazy light illuminated the full, horrific extent of the desolation. It showed a world without color, without life, a silent tableau of gray ruin stretching as far as the eye could see, confirming the survivors' worst fears. While the land was being buried, the sea rose up to attack. The immense energy released by the pyroclastic flows crashing into the ocean, combined with the collapse of the newly formed caldera, displaced a vast amount of water. This generated a series of tsunamis that radiated outwards from Sumbawa. These were not clean, singular waves, but chaotic and powerful surges of water, filled with floating pumice and debris from the destroyed coastline, which increased their destructive power. The waves struck the shores of Sumbawa first, washing away what little remained of coastal villages. But their reach extended far beyond. The coasts of nearby Lombok, Bali, and other islands in the Indonesian archipelago were inundated. Villages that had only experienced the ashfall and the distant sound of the eruption now found themselves assaulted by the sea. The waves, reaching several meters in height, swept inland, destroying homes, fishing boats, and rice paddies, adding thousands more to the growing death toll. The human cost of this localized devastation was staggering. While the initial explosions and pyroclastic flows instantly killed an estimated 12,000 people in the kingdoms of Tambora and Pekat, this was only the start. The subsequent tsunamis and the collapse of buildings under the weight of ash claimed thousands more lives in the immediate hours and days that followed the main eruption. But even this was just a fraction of the final, grim tally of the disaster. The true death toll mounted in the weeks and months that followed. On Sumbawa and Lombok especially, a severe famine began almost immediately. With all crops destroyed and all fresh water sources contaminated, the survivors had nothing to eat or drink. Starvation became rampant. The displaced and weakened population, huddled together in makeshift camps, became a breeding ground for disease. Dysentery and diarrhea, caused by contaminated water, spread like wildfire. Respiratory infections from the constant inhalation of sharp volcanic ash became common and were often fatal for the malnourished. The lack of sanitation and the prevalence of decomposing bodies, both human and animal, created a perfect storm for epidemics. For every one person killed by the eruption's direct force, at least 5 more would perish from the starvation and disease that followed in its wake. This secondary wave of death was silent, brutal, and far more protracted than the initial violence. Historians and volcanologists, piecing together colonial records, archaeological evidence, and scientific models, have tried to quantify the total loss of life. The most widely accepted estimates place the number of direct and immediate regional deaths at a minimum of 71,000. Some analyses suggest the figure could be much higher, possibly exceeding 100,000 people. This makes the 1815 eruption of Mount Tambora one of the deadliest volcanic events in all of recorded human history. The island of Sumbawa was almost entirely depopulated. Of the tens of thousands who had lived there, only a handful of scattered, starving survivors remained. Entire cultures and languages, like that of the Tamboran people, were extinguished completely, vanishing from the earth along with the people who spoke them. The local devastation was so complete that it created a vacuum, a demographic and cultural void that would take more than a century to begin to fill. The story of the local annihilation is one of almost unimaginable suffering. It is a stark reminder that the most spectacular aspects of a volcanic eruption, the sound, the ash column, the lightning, are often just the prelude. The true human tragedy unfolds quietly in the aftermath, in the silent struggle for survival in a world that has been fundamentally and irrevocably broken. The tens of thousands who perished in the shadow of Tambora were the first and most forgotten victims of a catastrophe that would soon be felt across the entire globe. While the immediate, violent fury of Tambora had subsided, leaving a scarred and silent island in its wake, the eruption was far from over. Its most profound impact had not been delivered by sound or shockwave, but had been quietly dispatched on a journey to the highest reaches of the atmosphere. The cataclysm on Sumbawa was a local tragedy, but the mountain had also launched a silent, insidious agent of chaos that would soon affect every person on Earth. The true disaster was not the roar of the explosion, but the silence of the veil that followed it. The story of this global catastrophe begins in the colossal eruption column that had punched its way into the sky. While the visible part of this plume was composed of heavy ash and pulverized rock, which fell back to Earth relatively quickly, it was the column's invisible cargo that held the most danger for the world. The eruption had blasted an enormous quantity of volcanic gases into the upper atmosphere, the most significant of which was sulfur dioxide, or SO2. This was the key ingredient for the global disruption to come. Volcanologists estimate that the 1815 eruption injected more than 60 million metric tons of sulfur dioxide directly into the stratosphere. To put this into perspective, it is more than 3 times the amount released by the 1991 eruption of Mount Pinatubo, a volcanic event famous for its own significant, albeit smaller, impact on global climate. This immense cloud of gas was the true legacy of Tambora, a chemical time bomb delivered to the edge of space. The destination of this gas was crucial. The stratosphere is the layer of our atmosphere that sits above the troposphere, the layer where we live and where all our weather occurs. Unlike the turbulent troposphere, where particles are quickly washed out by rain, the stratosphere is remarkably calm and stable. There's very little vertical mixing, and particles that find their way up there can remain suspended for several years, circling the globe undisturbed. By breaching this atmospheric boundary, Tambora had ensured its influence would be both long-lasting and widespread. The sulfur dioxide was not just in the air. It was trapped in a place where the planet's normal cleansing mechanisms could not reach it. High above the clouds, far from the winds and rains that would have washed it away, the gas cloud began its slow transformation, poised to affect the entire planet from above, an unseen menace in the highest heaven. Here, in the cold, thin air of the stratosphere, a slow and silent chemical reaction began to take place. The molecules of sulfur dioxide, SO2, started to bond with water vapor, which is also present in small amounts in this atmospheric layer. Through a series of chemical steps, this combination oxidized to form tiny liquid droplets, or aerosols, of sulfuric acid, H2SO4. A toxic gas was transforming into a fine, persistent mist, high above the world. This process was not instantaneous. Over the weeks and months following the eruption in April 1815, this chemical conversion continued. The vast cloud of sulfur dioxide slowly but surely turned into an even vaster cloud of microscopic sulfuric acid droplets. Each droplet was tiny, far too small to be seen with the naked eye, but their sheer number was astronomical. The eruption had created a planetary-scale chemical factory in the stratosphere, with a single ominous purpose. This newly formed mist of sulfuric acid did not stay in one place. It was caught by the high-altitude stratospheric winds, which act like massive, predictable jet streams. These winds began to transport the aerosol cloud, stretching and pulling it from its origin point over the Indonesian archipelago. Slowly at first, and then with increasing speed, the cloud began its silent journey, moving eastwards and westwards, destined to encircle the entire globe in a matter of weeks. The cloud spread first across the tropics, and then, over the following months, it migrated towards the poles. By the end of 1815, it had covered a significant portion of the planet. It was an invisible blanket, a translucent shroud being drawn over the entire world. This was the stratospheric veil, a thin, persistent layer of sulfuric acid aerosols that now stood between the Earth and the Sun, an unseen gatekeeper for the planet's warmth. The primary function of this veil was simple yet profound. It was highly reflective. The countless tiny droplets of sulfuric acid were like microscopic mirrors. When rays of sunlight traveling from the sun to the earth struck this layer of aerosols, a significant portion of that light was scattered and reflected directly back into space. The veil was effectively blocking a percentage of the sun's energy from ever reaching the surface and warming the land and the oceans. This phenomenon is known as reducing solar insolation. The planet's climate is a delicate balance of incoming solar energy and outgoing heat. By reducing the amount of energy entering the system, the Tambora veil had tipped this balance decisively. With less sunlight reaching the ground, the Earth's surface began to cool. The effect was subtle at first, but it was relentless and global in its scope. The planet's thermostat had been turned down. Before the cooling became noticeable, however, the new veil made its presence known in a different, more beautiful way. In the latter half of 1815 and throughout 1816, people across the world began to witness sunsets and twilights of an almost supernatural beauty and intensity. The skies would erupt in vibrant shades of red, orange, purple, and pink, lingering for hours after the sun had dipped below the horizon. The beauty was breathtaking, unlike anything anyone had seen before. These spectacular sunsets were a direct result of the new stratospheric aerosols. The tiny droplets were the perfect size to scatter the red wavelengths of sunlight, and as the sun set, its rays would travel through a greater thickness of the aerosol layer, causing these brilliant and prolonged displays of color. The phenomenon was so striking that it was noted in personal diaries, ship logs, and newspapers across Europe and North America, a beautiful mystery in the evening sky. Artists of the period, particularly the British romantic painter J.M.W. Turner, famous for his expressive and luminous skies, unknowingly became chroniclers of the disaster. His paintings from this period are renowned for their dramatic and intensely colored sunsets. Art historians now believe that Turner was not exaggerating for effect. He was likely painting exactly what he saw, the beautiful, eerie, atmospheric effects of Tambora's stratospheric veil. But this beauty was deceptive. It was the symptom of a profound atmospheric sickness, a beautiful fever dream before the illness truly took hold. While people on the ground marveled at the glorious skies, they were completely unaware that the very same particles creating this beauty were quietly and invisibly strangling the planet's energy supply. The magnificent sunsets were the calling card of a global climate disruption already well underway. The work of Tambora's unseen hand, the impact of this solar dimming was significant. Climate scientists, using ice core data and other proxies, estimate that the stratospheric veil from Tambora reduced the amount of solar radiation reaching the Earth's surface by an average of about 4%. While this may sound like a small number, on a planetary scale, it is an enormous disruption to the climate system, more than enough to trigger widespread and catastrophic changes to weather patterns. The result was a measurable drop in global average temperatures. It is estimated that the planet cooled by approximately 0.4 to 0.7 degrees Celsius, or about 1.3 degrees Fahrenheit. Again, this number seems modest, but the global average hides much more extreme regional variation. In some parts of the northern hemisphere, the cooling was far more severe, leading to devastating consequences for agriculture and human life, which depended on the predictable rhythm of the seasons. The veil's influence was at its peak during the summer of 1816. The presence of the aerosols not only cooled the planet, but also disrupted atmospheric circulation patterns, leading to chaotic and unseasonable weather. The jet stream, which governs weather in the mid-latitudes, was likely altered, leading to persistent cold troughs and unseasonable incursions of Arctic air far to the south. directly into the growing regions of Europe and North America. The silent, invisible veil that had wrapped itself around the world was now firmly in place. Its chemical composition was set, its reflective properties were at their maximum, and its influence on the world's climate was absolute. The stage was set for one of the most severe and unusual climate crises in recorded history. The unseen hand of Tambora was about to make its presence felt, not with a bang, but with a bitter, relentless, and unseasonable cold that would bring famine and despair to a world that never even knew it had been attacked. The immense shadow cast by Mount Tambora stretched far beyond the realms of agriculture, economics, and disease. It fell across the human imagination itself. The physical suffering of the post-eruption years was matched by a profound psychological and spiritual gloom. The darkened skies, the persistent cold, and the sense of a world gone wrong created an atmosphere of anxiety and despair that seeped into the very culture of the age. This bleak and mysterious climate, however, also became a strange and powerful muse, inspiring some of the most enduring works of art and literature in the Western canon. The early 19th century was the era of the Romantic movement, a cultural orientation that had already turned away from the cool reason of the Enlightenment to embrace emotion, individualism, and the awe-inspiring power of the natural world. Romantics were fascinated by the sublime, the experience of confronting nature in its most vast, powerful, and terrifying forms. They saw beauty in storms, wild mountains, and ancient ruins. A year without a summer provided them with a real-world experience of the sublime on a global and terrifying scale. The strange weather did not just create hardship, it created a new aesthetic. The world looked and felt different. The stratospheric aerosol veil, while a harbinger of famine, also produced visual phenomena of an eerie and spectacular beauty. The sunsets and twilights in particular were transformed. Sunlight scattered by the volcanic particles painted the sky in vivid, dramatic hues of red, orange, and violet that lingered for hours, far more intense than anyone had ever seen. These displays were noted with awe and wonder across the globe. This new, dramatic sky became a prominent feature in the art of the period. The British painter J.M.W. Turner, a master of capturing light and atmosphere, produced canvases during these years that are famous for their luminous, often turbulent and fiery skies. While Turner was already drawn to dramatic weather, the post-Tambora atmosphere provided him with a new and extraordinary palette. His paintings from this era, with their blazing orange and red sunsets, are now seen by scientists and art historians as an unwitting but remarkably accurate visual record of the volcanic veil. Similarly, the German Romantic painter Caspar David Friedrich, known for his contemplative and often melancholy landscapes, captured the gloom of the period. His works from these years are imbued with a sense of stillness, fog, and a weak, otherworldly light. His figures often stand with their backs to the viewer, gazing into a vast, hazy, and uncertain landscape. His art perfectly encapsulates the feeling of a world held in a perpetual, sunless twilight, a world where the familiar light of nature had been strangely altered. While the atmospheric effects left their mark on the visual arts, the most profound cultural echoes of Tambora can be found in the literature of the period. The mood of despair, the theme of a malevolent or indifferent nature, and the fear of a world spinning out of control became central preoccupations for many writers. The cold, the darkness, and the rain created a claustrophobic and introspective mood that was incredibly fertile ground for the Gothic imagination. The most famous and well-documented example of this creative incubation occurred during the miserable summer of 1816 at the Villa Diodati, a mansion on the shores of Lake Geneva in Switzerland. Here, a group of young, brilliant, and rebellious English writers had gathered for what they hoped would be an idyllic summer holiday. This legendary literary party consisted of the famous poet Lord Byron, his personal physician Dr. John Polidori, the poet Percy Bysshe Shelley, and Shelley's 18-year-old lover, Mary Wollstonecraft Godwin. Their hopes for a summer of boating and alpine walks were quickly dashed. The weather that year in Switzerland was atrocious. The wet, ungenial summer, as Mary would later call it, kept them imprisoned indoors for days on end. The rain was incessant and the sky was often dark and overcast. Violent electrical storms would frequently rage across the lake, illuminating the gloomy landscape with flashes of lightning. It was a perfect setting for a Gothic tale, and the bored, brilliant minds trapped within the villa soon set about creating their own. To pass the dreary hours huddled around the fire, they read from a collection of German ghost stories. One evening, Lord Byron proposed a challenge, that they should each try their hand at writing a ghost story of their own. This friendly contest, born of boredom and confinement in a world of endless rain, would have consequences that no one present could have possibly imagined. It would lead to the creation of two of the most iconic monsters in all of popular culture. Lord Byron, deeply affected by the oppressive gloom and the apocalyptic news of the famine spreading across Europe, penned a poem he simply called Darkness. It is one of the most direct and powerful artistic responses to the year without a summer. The poem describes a world where the sun is suddenly extinguished, plunging humanity into an eternal freezing night. It is a chilling vision of the complete collapse of civilization in the face of a climate catastrophe. Byron's poem begins, "I had a dream, which was not all a dream. The bright sun was extinguished, and the stars did wander darkling in the eternal space, rayless and pathless." He goes on to describe a world where people burn their homes for light and warmth, where birds fall from the sky, and where the survivors turn on each other in a final, desperate struggle for existence. The poem's imagery so closely mirrors the reality of 1816 that it stands as a powerful testament to the deep psychological impact of the event. Meanwhile, the young Mary Godwin struggled to come up with an idea for her ghost story. For days, her mind was blank. She listened intently as Byron and Shelley discussed the latest scientific theories of the day, including the concept of galvanism, the idea that life could be reanimated using electricity. The conversations, combined with the eerie atmosphere of the stormy, darkened villa, began to work on her subconscious. Then, one night, after listening to these strange conversations, Mary experienced what she would later describe as a waking dream. She envisioned the pale student of unhallowed arts kneeling beside the thing he had put together. She saw the hideous phantasm of a man stretched out, and then, on the working of some powerful engine, show signs of life, and stir with an uneasy, half-vital motion. She had found her story. From this single vivid vision, born in the claustrophobic gloom of the Tambora summer, Mary Shelley would go on to write her masterpiece, Frankenstein, or the modern Prometheus. The novel is steeped in the atmosphere of 1816. The landscapes are often bleak, icy, and unforgiving. The story is pervaded by a sense of isolation, alienation, and a fear of scientific ambition overreaching its bounds. Victor Frankenstein's monstrous creation is a powerful metaphor for a natural world that has been violated and has returned to haunt its creator. Frankenstein is arguably the most significant cultural artifact produced by the year without a summer. Its themes of a creator abandoning his creation and of a being rejected by society resonated deeply in an age of social and environmental upheaval. The novel's enduring power lies in its exploration of the dark side of progress and the consequences of tampering with the fundamental forces of nature, a theme that felt acutely relevant in a world where the climate itself had been broken by an unseen force. But Frankenstein was not the only monster born at the Villa Diodati. Dr. John Polidori, inspired by a fragment of a story written by Byron, penned a short tale called The Vampire. Before this story, vampires in folklore were brutish, peasant monsters. Polidori's creation, based on the charismatic and predatory persona of Lord Byron himself, was Lord Ruthven, a suave, aristocratic, and seductive figure who moved in high society. This was the birth of the modern vampire archetype that continues to dominate our books and films today. The cultural fallout from that single rainy summer was immense. Two of the foundational myths of the modern horror and science fiction genres were created as a direct result of the gloomy, confining weather caused by Tambora's eruption. The despair and introspection fostered by the endless rain forced these brilliant minds to turn inward and explore the darker corners of the human imagination. It is a remarkable chain of events. A volcanic eruption in Indonesia injects sulfur into the stratosphere, which alters the climate of Europe, which in turn traps a group of English writers indoors in Switzerland, leading them to invent the modern science fiction novel and the archetypal vampire. It is a powerful illustration of how deeply intertwined our planet's physical systems are with the currents of human thought and creativity. The cultural echoes of Tambora remind us that major historical events are not just measured in death tolls or economic losses. They are also measured in the stories we tell and the art we create to make sense of them. The year without a summer created a mood, an atmosphere of anxiety and awe that was perfectly suited to the romantic imagination. It provided a real-world canvas for their deepest fears and their most profound questions about nature, God, and humanity's place in a vast and often indifferent universe. The profound suffering of 1816 was not confined to the European continent. The stratospheric veil of sulfuric acid was a global phenomenon, and its chilling effects were felt across the northern hemisphere and beyond. While Europeans starved and wondered what divine power they had offended, similar scenes of agricultural crisis and human desperation were unfolding thousands of kilometers away in North America. The unseen hand of Tambora had reached across the Atlantic, bringing a summer of ice and hardship to the young United States and Canada. The year became grimly immortalized in the folklore of New England as 1800 and froze to death. Just as in Europe, the spring of 1816 was deceptively cold and wet. Farmers, pushing ahead with the optimism of a new season, planted their crops as usual, expecting the familiar warmth of May and June to bring them to life. But the warmth never came. The sun remained a pale, distant orb, and the ground stayed stubbornly cold. An unnatural chill persisted, a quiet omen of the disastrous summer that was about to unfold. The first shocking event occurred in early June. A blast of frigid air, more typical of deep winter, descended from the Arctic. On June 6th, a heavy snowstorm blanketed parts of New England and eastern Canada. Snow fell in Albany, New York, and Quebec City, accumulating to depths of several inches in some areas. The green shoots of newly planted corn and other vegetables were buried under a blanket of white. For farmers who saw it, it was a sight of pure disbelief and terror, a profound violation of the natural order of the seasons. The cold snap was not a fleeting event. Throughout June, July, and even into August, a series of severe frosts swept across the eastern states. Ice was reported on ponds and lakes in Pennsylvania during July. In Virginia, the home of Thomas Jefferson, high-elevation farms experienced crop-killing frosts in August. Farmers would replant their fields after one frost, only to have the new shoots killed by another a few weeks later. The summer became a heartbreaking cycle of futile labor and dashed hopes, a continuous battle against a relentless, inexplicable cold. The corn crop, a vital staple for both humans and livestock, was a near-total failure in New England. The plant, which requires warm nights to mature, simply could not grow in the persistent cold. The failure of the hay crop was equally devastating, meaning there would be little feed for livestock in the coming winter. The agricultural economy of the eastern seaboard, from the Canadian Maritimes down to the Carolinas, was crippled. The lands, the very foundation of American life, had failed them. Much like in Europe, the scarcity of food led to a dramatic spike in prices. The cost of grain, flour, and meat soared beyond the reach of ordinary families. Newspapers of the time are filled with reports of food shortages and the high price of provisions. While the famine was perhaps not as severe as in parts of war-torn Europe, there was widespread hardship and hunger. Families were forced to sell their livestock for a fraction of their value, as they could no longer afford to feed them. This agricultural disaster is believed to have been a significant catalyst for a major chapter in American history: westward expansion. The failed harvests and economic hardship in the eastern states, particularly in rocky New England, convinced many families that their future lay in the more fertile lands of the Ohio Valley and the Midwest. The year 1816 saw a marked acceleration of migration towards the west, as families sought to escape the poverty year. Among the families who made this westward journey were the Lincolns of Kentucky. In December of 1816, facing economic hardship partly exacerbated by the agricultural crisis, Thomas Lincoln moved his family, including his 7-year-old son Abraham, to a new life in Indiana. While multiple factors influenced their move, the grim conditions of that year played a role in pushing countless families like them to seek their fortunes on a new frontier, reshaping the demographic map of the nation. While North America shivered, the climatic chaos wrought by Tambora was manifesting differently in other parts of the world. In Asia, the impact was not primarily one of cold, but of a profound disruption to the most vital weather system on the planet: the monsoon. The stratospheric veil, by cooling the vast landmass of Asia, weakened the crucial temperature difference between the land and the Indian Ocean, which is the engine that drives the summer monsoon rains. In 1816, the Indian summer monsoon was severely weakened. It failed to deliver its life-giving rains to many parts of the subcontinent. The result was a widespread and catastrophic drought. Fields dried up, crops withered, and the specter of famine, an all-too-familiar foe in India, once again descended upon the population. The failure of the monsoon was a direct consequence of the atmospheric changes caused by a volcano thousands of kilometers away. This drought, however, was just the prelude to an even more sinister and far-reaching disaster. When the rains did eventually return, they were erratic and fell upon a parched, hardened landscape, leading to flooding and stagnant pools of water. This disruption created the perfect environmental conditions in the Ganges Delta of Bengal for a terrifying evolutionary event. Within the brackish, contaminated water, a new, more virulent and deadly strain of the bacterium Vibrio cholerae began to thrive. For centuries, cholera had been a localized disease in the Bengal region, but this new strain was different. It was hardier, more aggressive, and it triggered a far more severe form of the disease. In 1817, an epidemic of this new cholera broke out in Bengal, spreading rapidly among a population already weakened by the drought and famine of the previous year. The disease was horrific, causing rapid dehydration and often death within hours. This was the birth of the world's first cholera pandemic. From its incubator in the Ganges Delta, an incubator created by the climatic chaos of Tambora, the disease began its slow, inexorable march across the globe. Carried by merchants, sailors, and soldiers along trade routes, it spread throughout India. From there, it moved into Southeast Asia, the Middle East, and Russia. By the early 1830s, it had reached Western Europe and had even crossed the Atlantic to North America, the very continent that had been freezing just a decade and a half earlier. Over the next few decades, this single pandemic, born from the environmental fallout of Tambora, would claim the lives of millions of people across the world. It was a plague of unprecedented scale, and its origins can be traced back to the subtle atmospheric shifts and the resulting drought and flood conditions that followed the eruption. The link is a chilling example of how a geological event can trigger a biological one, with consequences that echo for generations. The reach of Tambora was truly global, its effects complex and varied. In China, particularly in the Yunnan province, the cold weather and failed monsoons led to a devastating famine that lasted for 3 years. In other parts of the world, the effects are less well documented but no less real. The eruption was a single, planetary-scale event that pushed a global climate system already in a cool phase past a critical tipping point. The story of 1816 is therefore not just one of a cold summer in Europe and America, it is a story of interconnectedness. It reveals how a volcanic eruption in Indonesia could lead to snow in a New England summer, prompt a future president's family to move west, and most terrifyingly disrupt the Asian monsoon in a way that unleashed a deadly new pandemic upon the entire world. It was a truly global hunger, a global sickness, all stemming from a single catastrophic day. The cataclysm of Mount Tambora did not end with frost and famine. The empty fields and the silent, sunless summer of 1816 were just the first act in a far longer and deadlier tragedy. Famine, throughout human history, has rarely traveled alone. Its constant and faithful companion is disease. The widespread malnutrition that gripped the world in the years following the eruption created the perfect conditions for epidemics to flourish, turning a crisis of hunger into a devastating global pestilence that would claim millions more lives. The relationship between hunger and sickness is a grimly simple one. A malnourished body is a weakened body. The human immune system, deprived of the essential nutrients and calories it needs to function, cannot effectively fight off infections. A common cold can become pneumonia. A small infection can become septic. Entire populations living on the brink of starvation become immensely vulnerable to opportunistic pathogens that a healthy body would easily repel. The famine of 1816 had effectively disarmed the people of the world, leaving them defenseless against the microbial enemies that were about to rise. In the cold, damp, and desperate conditions of post-Napoleonic Europe, an old and feared killer found a new lease on life. This was typhus, a disease so closely associated with hardship that it was known by many names: famine fever, gowel fever, and camp fever. It thrived in conditions of poverty, crowding, and social breakdown, the very conditions that the Tambora famine had created on a continental scale. As starving people abandoned their homes and crowded into squalid shelters or took to the roads as beggars, they created the ideal environment for the spread of this disease. Typhus is not spread by a virus or bacteria in the air, but by a tiny insect, the human body louse. In times of crisis, when people are unable to wash themselves or their clothing, lice populations explode. The bacterium Rickettsia proazici lives in the gut of the louse and is excreted in its feces. When an infected louse bites a human, it defecates. The person's scratching of the bite rubs the infected feces into the wound, and the infection begins. It is a disease born directly from squalor and desperation. The symptoms of famine fever were terrifying. After an incubation period, the victim would be struck by a high fever, severe headache, and debilitating muscle pain. This would be followed by the appearance of a characteristic rash of dark red spots across the body. The most frightening symptom was the neurological decline. Sufferers would often become delirious, agitated, and confused, a state from which many would never recover. In an age without antibiotics, typhus was frequently a death sentence, with mortality rates as high as 40%. Beginning in 1816 and peaking in the years 1817 to 1819, a major typhus epidemic swept across Europe, following the precise map of the famine. It raged through Ireland, where the failure of the potato crop had created immense suffering. It spread through the impoverished cantons of Switzerland and the struggling states of Italy and Germany. The Balkans, already suffering from political instability, were also hit hard. The epidemic moved with the starving migrants, flourishing in the overcrowded poorhouses and makeshift camps where the hungry sought refuge. This epidemic claimed the lives of tens of thousands, adding immeasurably to the death toll of the year without a summer. It was a disease that disproportionately affected the poor and the displaced. While the wealthy could afford to isolate themselves and maintain their hygiene, the starving masses had no such luxury. The typhus outbreak was a stark and brutal illustration of how a climate-induced crisis could cascade into a full-blown public health catastrophe, preying on the most vulnerable members of society. Typhus, however, was not the only disease to flourish in the misery of post-Tambora Europe. The breakdown of sanitation and the contamination of water sources with human and animal waste led to widespread outbreaks of other infectious diseases. Dysentery, a severe form of infectious diarrhea, became rampant in many communities. This, combined with other waterborne illnesses, created a lethal cocktail of disease that further weakened the starving population, particularly children and the elderly. It was a multi-pronged assault of sickness on a continent already on its knees. Meanwhile, on the other side of the world, a far more significant and terrifying microbial event was unfolding. As we have seen, the climatic chaos in Asia, particularly the disruption of the Indian monsoon, had created the perfect environmental crucible in the Ganges Delta. The drought of 1816, followed by erratic flooding, had allowed a new, hypervirulent strain of the cholera bacterium, Vibrio cholerae, to evolve and establish itself. This was not just the resurgence of an old disease, it was the birth of a new global plague. For centuries, cholera had been an endemic, seasonal illness largely confined to the lower Ganges region. But the new strain that emerged in 1817 was different. It was more robust, capable of surviving longer in the environment, and it produced a much more powerful toxin. This new evolutionary advantage allowed it to break out of its traditional geographic boundaries and unleash a pandemic upon an unsuspecting world. The environmental stress caused by Tambora had, in effect, weaponized an ancient disease. The first major outbreak of this new pandemic began in the city of Calcutta in 1817. The symptoms were horrific and progressed with terrifying speed. A person could be healthy in the morning and dead by evening. The disease caused a massive, painless, watery diarrhea, often described as rice stoles. This led to such rapid and extreme dehydration that the victim's blood would thicken, their skin would turn a bluish-gray color, and their muscles would cramp violently. Without rehydration, shock and death were almost inevitable. This new aggressive form of cholera caused widespread panic. Local authorities and British colonial officials were completely unprepared for a disease of such speed and lethality. It spread from Calcutta up the Ganges River and then throughout the Indian subcontinent, leaving a trail of death in its wake. The initial outbreak in India alone is estimated to have killed hundreds of thousands of people, but the bacterium was just beginning its journey. From its new larger reservoir in India, the cholera pandemic began its global march. It was carried by the very agents of the new globalized world, British troops, merchant ships, and overland trade caravans. By 1820, it had spread to Siam, now Thailand, and to Indonesia, the very archipelago where the eruption had occurred. By 1821, it had reached the Persian Gulf, traveling up through modern-day Iraq and Syria. The plague was moving steadily westward toward Europe. This first wave of the pandemic eventually burned itself out in the mid-1000s, 820s, but it was only a temporary reprieve. A second, even larger pandemic, caused by the same Tambora-birthed strain, erupted from the Ganges Delta again in 1829. This time, it would not be stopped. It swept through Russia, and by 1831 it had arrived in the major cities of Western Europe, including London and Paris. In 1832, it crossed the Atlantic, bringing terror to the cities of North America. This second pandemic, a direct descendant of the first, would kill millions of people across the world. For the next century, a series of devastating cholera pandemics would sweep the globe, all of them tracing their lineage back to that single evolutionary event in the Ganges Delta in 1817. The environmental chaos of Tambora had not just caused a famine, it had launched a new global plague that would define much of the 19th century. The full death toll of the Tambora eruption, therefore, cannot be counted in the ashes of Sumbawa or the frozen fields of 1816. The true mortality is far higher, a long, drawn-out count of bodies that stretches across decades and continents. The estimated 100,000 who died from the blast, tsunamis, and immediate local famine were just the first victims. The subsequent typhus and dysentery epidemics in Europe added tens, if not hundreds of thousands more. But even that pales in comparison to the legacy of cholera. While it is impossible to give a precise number, the series of cholera pandemics that originated in 1817 killed many millions of people throughout the 19th century. This new virulent strain, a direct biological consequence of the eruption's climatic impact, was arguably the single deadliest legacy of Tambora. It was a microbial monster, born from a geological cataclysm. The story of these epidemics is a profound lesson in the interconnectedness of our planet's systems. It shows how a geological event can trigger a climatic crisis, which in turn creates a famine, which then leads to a catastrophic breakdown in public health. The starving farmers of Ireland, the terrified citizens of Calcutta, and the cholera victims in Paris were all, in their own way, victims of the same event. They were all touched by the long, cold, and pestilential shadow of a mountain on the other side of the world. The relentless cold and persistent hunger of 1816 did more than just ruin harvests and weaken bodies. They began to dissolve the very glue that holds society together, the intricate web of laws, traditions, trust, and mutual obligations that allows communities to function began to fray and snap under the unbearable strain. The crisis triggered by Mount Tambora was not just an agricultural disaster, it was a profound social cataclysm, one that led to riots, crime, and a great desperate migration of people across a fractured world. When the food ran out, the old rules no longer applied. In a pre-industrial world, the vast majority of people were tied to the land, living in the same village their ancestors had. This life was governed by a predictable rhythm, but the famine shattered this stability. With their fields barren and their food stores empty, countless families in Europe faced a stark choice: stay and starve, or abandon their homes and take to the roads in a desperate search for sustenance. They chose the latter, and in doing so, they became a terrifying new feature of the post-Tambora landscape. These were the wandering poor, the beggar armies that roamed the countryside of Ireland, Germany, Switzerland, and France. They were entire families, gaunt and clothed in rags, moving from town to town, their numbers swelling as they went. They were not simply travelers, they were refugees of a climate disaster, stripped of their homes, their livelihoods, and their dignity. Their sudden appearance on the outskirts of a town, desperate and hungry, was a source of immense fear for settled communities who were already struggling to feed themselves. The response of these settled communities was often one of fear and hostility. Doors were barred, and charity, already stretched thin, was often refused. The wandering poor were seen not as neighbors in crisis, but as a dangerous threat, a potential source of disease and crime. This breakdown of empathy and solidarity, this turning of villager against villager, was one of the most tragic social consequences of the famine. In the face of overwhelming scarcity, the bonds of community were among the first casualties. Where desperation grew, social order collapsed. In the cities of Europe, the simmering anger of the hungry masses exploded into open violence. Food riots became a common occurrence. A crowd would gather, sparked by a rumor of a merchant hoarding grain or a baker charging an exorbitant price for a loaf of bread. This crowd would quickly become a mob, storming marketplaces, looting bakeries, and seizing grain warehouses. These were not acts of simple criminality, they were acts of collective survival. The authorities, often representing newly restored monarchies after the Napoleonic Wars, responded to this unrest with force. They saw the riots not as a symptom of starvation, but as a challenge to their authority. Militias and government troops were deployed to disperse the crowds, and the confrontations often ended in bloodshed. The image of starving citizens being fired upon by soldiers became a grimly repeated scene across the continent. A state was protecting the principle of property over the lives of its people. Grain convoys, transporting what little food there was between cities, became moving targets. They had to be heavily guarded by armed soldiers to protect them from attacks by organized bands of starving people. The roads became dangerous places, plagued by banditry. People who had once been peaceful farmers were transformed by hunger into highwaymen, driven by the need to feed their children. The line between victim and perpetrator blurred in the moral gray zone of a world without food. Governments, for their part, were completely overwhelmed. Their attempts at relief were often too little, too late. Some municipalities set up soup kitchens, but the demand far outstripped their capacity. Many governments, steeped in the economic philosophies of the day, were hesitant to interfere with the market by controlling food prices, which allowed speculation and hoarding to run rampant. Their primary response was often one of repression, enacting harsh laws against begging and vagrancy, effectively criminalizing the act of being poor and hungry. Across the Atlantic, in the young United States, the social consequences took a different but equally transformative shape. The year without a summer was a catastrophe for the farmers of New England and the eastern states. The repeated crop failures made their small, rocky farms untenable. For these families, the crisis acted as a powerful push factor, convincing them that their future did not lie in the cold and unforgiving east. Their eyes turned westward, towards the promise of the fertile Ohio Valley. This led to a dramatic acceleration of westward expansion. The year 1816 and those immediately following saw a flood of migration from states like Vermont, New Hampshire, and Connecticut into Ohio, Indiana, and Illinois. This mass movement became known as Ohio Fever. It was a desperate exodus, a great shuffling of the American population Driven by the failure of the climate, families packed their meager belongings onto wagons and set out on arduous journeys, leaving behind their ancestral homes forever. This migration fundamentally reshaped the American landscape. It hastened the clearing of forests, the establishment of new towns, and the transformation of the Midwest into the nation's new breadbasket. The hardship of 1816, while devastating for the East, became a foundational event for the West. It was a demographic shift born of climate shock, a testament to how environmental crises can redraw the map and redirect the course of a nation's history. It was a clear demonstration that when one part of the land fails, people will seek a new one. This period also saw a breakdown of trust on a more spiritual level. The relentless cold and sunless skies were interpreted by many as a sign of divine anger. Apocalyptic fears surged, and charismatic preachers attracted followers with sermons about the end of days. In a world governed by faith, the failure of the seasons felt like a failure of God himself. This religious anxiety added another layer of psychological torment to the physical suffering of hunger and disease. In this atmosphere of fear and scarcity, the search for scapegoats began. In some communities, blame for the bad weather and failed crops was placed on outsiders, vagrants, or minority groups. The crisis frayed not only the bonds between citizens and their government, but also the bonds between neighbors. Suspicion replaced trust, and the communal spirit that is essential for survival in hard times was eroded by the all-consuming struggle for individual preservation. The social order was further strained by the invisible crisis of debt. Farmers had borrowed money to buy seed and supplies at the beginning of the year, expecting to pay it back after the harvest. When the harvest failed, they were left with nothing but debt. This led to a wave of foreclosures and bankruptcies, forcing even more people off their land and into a state of destitution. The economic foundations of rural society crumbled alongside its agricultural ones. The sheer scale of the displacement was unprecedented. In Switzerland, some cantons lost a significant portion of their population to emigration or starvation. In Ireland, the famine exacerbated the already dire poverty and contributed to the waves of emigration that would become a defining feature of Irish history. The world was in motion, a great, chaotic shuffling of peoples driven by the most basic human instinct, the search for food. This mass migration was not an orderly process. It was a desperate flight marked by hardship and suffering. Families traveled on foot, sleeping in the open, vulnerable to weather, disease, and crime. They arrived in new lands with nothing, often to be met with suspicion and hostility. The journey itself was a crucible, testing the limits of human endurance and resilience. Ultimately, the great social unrest of the post-Tambora years demonstrates a fundamental truth. Human society is a part of the environment, not separate from it. Our social and economic systems are built upon an assumption of climatic stability. When that stability is removed, those systems are revealed to be incredibly fragile. The intricate structures of law, commerce, and community can be dismantled with shocking speed by something as simple as a lack of sunlight. The world that emerged from the year without a summer was a changed one. It was a world where social tensions had been laid bare, where governments had been tested and found wanting, and where vast populations had been uprooted and set on new paths. The legacy of Tambora was not just a story of cold and hunger, but of how societies fracture, and how people, in their desperation, are forced to remake their lives and their communities in the face of an existential threat they cannot see or understand. The colossal failure of the 2016 harvest was more than a humanitarian crisis. It was a devastating body blow to the entire global economy. In the early 19th century, the world ran on an agricultural engine. The wealth of nations, the stability of governments, and the livelihoods of the vast majority of people were directly tied to the soil and the success of the annual harvest. When the crops failed on a continental scale, it triggered a catastrophic economic depression, a synchronized collapse that rippled outwards from the barren fields to paralyze workshops, banks, and markets across the Western world. The economic bedrock of this era was grain. It was the primary food source, the measure of wealth, and the most crucial commodity. The immediate and most visceral economic impact of the year without a summer was a sudden and violent shock to the price of this essential good. As it became clear that the harvests were failing, a panic swept through the grain markets. Merchants began to hoard their supplies, speculating on future scarcity while demand from a frightened populace surged. The fundamental laws of supply and demand enacted a swift and brutal judgment. The result was a period of staggering food price inflation. In parts of Europe and North America, the price of wheat, oats, barley, and potatoes quadrupled, and in some severely affected regions it increased by a factor of 10. A loaf of bread, the staple food that constituted the bulk of a working family's diet, became a luxury item. This wasn't a gradual increase, it was a sudden vertical spike that pushed the cost of basic survival beyond the reach of millions. For the poor, this was a form of hyperinflation that targeted the very calories they needed to live. While the price of food spiraled out of control, wages remained stagnant or in many cases fell due to the broader economic downturn. This created a devastating economic squeeze. A family that once spent half its income on food now found that its entire weekly wage could barely purchase enough bread to fend off starvation. There was simply no money left for anything else. This disappearance of disposable income was the next domino to fall in a long and painful cascade of economic ruin. The second-order effect of the food crisis was a catastrophic collapse in demand for all other goods and services. With every spare coin being saved for a loaf of bread or a sack of potatoes, the market for non-essential items vanished almost overnight. People stopped buying new clothes, new shoes, or new tools. They could not afford to repair their homes, visit the local tavern, or purchase the small luxuries that kept local economies turning. Demand for manufactured goods, from textiles to ironwork, simply evaporated. This demand shock hit the artisan and manufacturing sectors with incredible force. Weavers found themselves with no one to buy their cloth. Blacksmiths had no orders for new tools or horseshoes. Carpenters, masons, and other tradesmen found themselves without work as all construction projects ground to a halt. In the burgeoning industrial towns of Britain, textile mills laid off workers as warehouses filled with unsold fabric. The agricultural crisis had metastasized into a widespread unemployment crisis, affecting both rural and urban populations. The economic pain was particularly acute in the countryside, even for those who did not starve. The entire rural economy was built on a system of credit that was predicated on a successful harvest. Farmers routinely took out loans at the beginning of the season to purchase seeds, tools, and other supplies. The understanding was that these loans would be repaid with interest once the crops were sold. In 1816, this system collapsed completely. With no crops to sell, farmers across Europe and America had no income. They were unable to pay back their loans, leading to a massive wave of defaults. They were also unable to pay their rents to landlords or their taxes to the state. This created a rural credit crisis of unprecedented scale. The farmer, the foundational producer in the economic system, was now bankrupt, and this insolvency began to climb the economic ladder. Landlords who depended on rental income from their tenant farmers were now faced with a total loss of revenue. They, in turn, were unable to pay their own debts or maintain their estates. In many hard-hit agricultural regions, the value of land itself plummeted. Who would want to buy a farm in a place where nothing would grow? This collapse in the value of the primary asset of the era placed immense strain on the entire financial system. The rural banks that had issued the agricultural loans were the next to fall. With their loan books filled with defaulted debts and the collateral, the land, now worth a fraction of its former value, these banks became insolvent. A wave of bank failures swept through agricultural regions, particularly in the United States. The collapse of these local banks wiped out the savings of depositors and, crucially, choked off the supply of credit to the wider economy, making a bad situation even worse. The crisis also threw international trade into chaos. Nations that were traditional exporters of grain, such as Russia and the United States, quickly moved to protect their own populations by enacting export bans. This was a logical domestic policy, but it had a devastating effect on grain-importing nations like Britain and Switzerland. The global market for food, which could have provided some relief, was frozen by protectionism, stayed in port, and international commerce seized up. Governments found themselves in an impossible position. The economic collapse caused their tax revenues to plummet. At the very same time, the widespread suffering created an overwhelming demand for public relief. The state was simultaneously losing its income and facing soaring, unbudgeted expenses. This fiscal crisis pushed many governments, already deeply in debt from the Napoleonic Wars, to the very brink of bankruptcy. Their responses were varied and often inadequate. In Britain, the government temporarily suspended the controversial corn laws, which had kept the price of imported grain artificially high in a desperate attempt to lower the cost of bread. Across Europe, municipalities and charities established soup kitchens and distributed what little food they could, but these efforts were a mere drop in an ocean of need. Some governments initiated public works projects to provide employment, but they lacked the funds to do so on a scale that would make a significant difference. The economic depression triggered by Tambora had a long tail. The immediate crisis of 1816 was followed by several more years of hardship. It took time for farmers to recover from their debts, for livestock herds to be rebuilt, and for the intricate networks of commerce to be restored. The year 1817 was also a year of poor harvests, as grain stores were so depleted that there was a shortage of seed to plant for the new season. The economic aftershocks of 1816 were felt for the better part of a decade. This period of prolonged economic hardship left a deep psychological scar. It fueled social unrest and political instability, contributing to the revolutionary fervor that would sweep across Europe in the subsequent decades. It also fundamentally altered economic behavior. The crisis drove home the immense vulnerability of a purely agrarian economy, which may have spurred on the process of industrialization as a perceived path to greater economic stability and resilience. In North America, the economic consequences were a key driver of one of the nation's most significant historical processes. The collapse of the Eastern agricultural economy provided a powerful economic incentive for a westward migration. It was a clear demonstration of the push factor in history, where negative conditions in one region pushed people to seek better opportunities elsewhere. The economic ruin of New England became the economic foundation of the Midwest. Looking back, the post-Tambora period can be seen as one of the first truly global economic depressions. Unlike previous crises that were often regional or caused by wars, this was a downturn triggered by a single, exogenous shock to the global climate system. It revealed the surprising interconnectedness of the 19th century world. A synchronized agricultural failure in Europe and North America created a synchronized economic collapse, demonstrating a new and worrying form of systemic risk. The Great Depression of 1816 was a lesson written in hunger and bankruptcy. It showed that the price of bread in London could be dictated by a geological event in Indonesia. It proved that the viability of a farm in Vermont was linked to the composition of the stratosphere. It was a stark and brutal illustration of the fact that the human economy, for all its seeming complexity and power, was and remains utterly dependent on the stability of the natural world and the predictable turning of the seasons. Just as no night lasts forever, the long gloomy twilight of the year without a summer eventually began to recede. High in the stratosphere, the fine veil of sulfuric acid aerosols that had shrouded the planet slowly began to dissipate. Gravity, acting over months and years, gradually pulled the tiny droplets down into the lower atmosphere, where they were finally washed out by the rain. By 1817, the skies were noticeably brighter, and by 1818 and 1819, the global climate system began its slow, halting journey back towards equilibrium. The sun's warmth started to feel familiar again. The seasons began to realign themselves into their customary rhythm. Spring rains were once more followed by summer warmth, and the promise of a reliable harvest returned to the land. For the survivors of the Great Famine, this return to normalcy must have felt like a slow, collective awakening from a long and terrible nightmare. The earth was healing, and with it humanity began the arduous process of picking up the pieces and rebuilding a world that had been pushed to the very brink of collapse. The first and most crucial step in this recovery was agricultural. The farmers who had survived the crisis had learned a bitter lesson in the fragility of their livelihoods. In the years that followed, there was a noticeable shift in farming practices across Europe and North America. The catastrophe spurred a move towards greater agricultural resilience and diversification. Farmers began to plant a wider variety of crops, hoping to avoid the kind of total failure that had occurred when their single staple, like corn or potatoes, had failed. In continental Europe, the crisis ironically led to the more widespread adoption of the potato. While the crop had failed in the wet and cold of Ireland in 1816, its general hardiness and ability to grow in poor soil made it an attractive insurance policy against the failure of grain crops. Governments, having witnessed the devastating effects of famine, also began to take a more active role in food security. Many established national grain reserves, or ever-normal granaries, to be used as a buffer against future shortages. The economic recovery was a much slower and more painful process. The depression that began in 1816 lingered for the better part of a decade. The immense loss of capital in the form of failed farms, dead livestock, and shuttered workshops could not be replaced overnight. The web of credit and debt had been shattered, and it took years for trust and stability to return to the financial system. The world economy had been deeply wounded, and the scar tissue would remain for many years. Populations had been displaced, industries had been disrupted, and national treasuries had been drained. The recovery was not a swift bounce back, but a slow, grinding climb out of a deep economic hole. It required the rebuilding of infrastructure, the re-establishment of trade routes, and the slow reaccumulation of wealth. The generation that lived through the post-Tambora years was a generation defined by hardship, their lives shaped by the long economic shadow of that single volcanic eruption. And yet, as life slowly returned to a semblance of normality, a strange and profound collective amnesia began to set in. The memory of the year without a summer remained, of course, as a piece of folklore, a story of a bizarrely cold and difficult time. But the understanding of it as a single, interconnected global event caused by a specific geological cataclysm was almost entirely lost. The true cause of the misery was forgotten, replaced by a host of local explanations and supernatural beliefs. For the vast majority of people who suffered through the crisis, the cause remained a complete and utter mystery. In an age still steeped in religious belief, the most common explanation was that the cold, the rain, and the famine were a manifestation of divine wrath. Many saw it as God's punishment for the sins of humanity, particularly the decades of brutal warfare that had just concluded with the Napoleonic era. It was interpreted as a divine judgment, a call to repentance delivered through the language of failed crops and darkened skies. Others looked for more earthly, albeit incorrect, explanations. Some blamed the strange weather on the new lightning rods that Benjamin Franklin had invented, believing they were somehow interfering with the atmosphere's natural electrical balance. Others noted the unusual number of sunspots that had been observed in the years leading up to 1816 and speculated that the sun itself was growing cold. Each region, each community, interpreted the crisis through the lens of its own local beliefs and anxieties. The scientific community of the day, for its part, also failed to connect the dots. While a few astute observers, including Franklin himself years earlier, had speculated that volcanic eruptions could cause cold, hazy weather, the idea was not widely accepted. The concept of a single volcano in the distant Dutch East Indies affecting the weather in Switzerland and New England was simply too vast, too radical for the scientific framework of the time. The world still felt too big, the connections too tenuous to be grasped. Scientists of the era were highly specialized and lacked the tools for global data collection. A botanist in France studying crop failures had no way of knowing that a physician in India was battling a new cholera epidemic, or that a farmer in Vermont was shoveling snow in June. There were no global communication networks, no international scientific bodies to correlate the disparate and confusing pieces of evidence from around the world. The puzzle remained in pieces, scattered across continents. News of the Tambora eruption itself had eventually reached Europe and America, but it was treated as a curiosity, a dramatic but local disaster story from a remote and exotic part of the world. No one made the crucial connection between the report of an exploding mountain in April of 1815 and the failure of their own harvests more than a year later. The lag time between the cause and its most widespread effects made the link incredibly difficult to perceive without a modern understanding of atmospheric science. And so, the greatest climate crisis of the last millennium was largely forgotten by the generations that followed. It was remembered as a series of disconnected, unfortunate events: a cold summer in America, a famine in Germany, a typhus outbreak in Ireland, a cholera pandemic from India. The single unifying cause, the invisible hand of Tambora, was lost in the fog of history, a forgotten prime mover whose influence was felt everywhere but understood almost nowhere. The truth did not begin to re-emerge until the 20th century, with the birth of modern climatology. In the 1910s, American physicist William Humphreys was one of the first scientists to systematically build a case for the connection between major volcanic eruptions and global cooling, citing Tambora as the key example. He correctly theorized that it was not the ash, but the fine dust and sulfuric acid gas in the stratosphere that was responsible for blocking sunlight. But the definitive proof would have to wait until the 1960s and 70s, with the advent of new scientific techniques. By drilling deep into the ice sheets of Greenland and Antarctica, scientists were able to extract ice cores that contained a detailed record of the Earth's atmosphere, going back thousands of years. In these cores, they found a distinct layer of highly acidic ice rich in sulfuric acid, precisely dated to the year 1816. This was the chemical fingerprint of the Tambora Veil, the smoking gun that definitively linked the eruption to the global climate crisis. Modern climate models, run on powerful supercomputers, have since confirmed and expanded upon this understanding. Scientists can now simulate the eruption and accurately chart the spread of the aerosol veil and its subsequent impact on global temperatures and weather patterns. The great mystery of the 19th century has been solved by the science of the 21st. The forgotten cause has been rediscovered. A final poignant reminder of the eruption's origin came in 2004, with the archaeological discovery of the Pompeii of the East. The unearthing of the village that had been buried by the Pyrolastic flows on Sumbawa provided a direct human connection back to the epicenter of the cataclysm. It was a powerful reminder of the eruption's forgotten first victims, the people who experienced not just a cold summer, but the full, fiery, and instantaneous fury of the mountain itself. The story of Tambora is therefore a story of both remarkable resilience and profound forgetfulness. It is a testament to the ability of human beings to endure, adapt, and rebuild in the face of almost unimaginable hardship. From the farmers who learned to plant new crops to the societies that slowly reconstructed their economies, the recovery demonstrates a deep and abiding strength. But it is also a cautionary tale about the limits of our perception and the fragility of our collective memory. It shows how easily the thread of causation can be lost and how, in the absence of a clear scientific understanding, we can resort to superstition or simply fail to see the larger picture. The world had suffered from a single global wound, but for nearly 2 centuries, almost no one remembered the name of the weapon that had inflicted it. As the year 1815 drew to a close, a sense of wary optimism was beginning to take root across Europe. The long and bloody Napoleonic Wars were finally over, soldiers were returning home, and the continent was hoping for a period of peace and recovery. The foundation of this recovery, as it had always been, was the land itself. A good harvest in the coming year of 1816 was not just hoped for, it was essential for a populace exhausted by years of conflict and turmoil. The rhythm of the seasons was a promise of stability in a world that had known little of it. But as winter grudgingly gave way to spring in 1816, a strange and persistent chill lingered in the air. The expected warmth failed to arrive. March and April were marked not by gentle thaws and new growth, but by unseasonable cold, bleak gray skies, and an unsettling damp gloom. Farmers waited for the soil to warm, but it remained cold and barren. The buds on the trees were late to appear, and when they did, they were small and tentative. A deep sense of unease began to creep across the continent as the natural order of things felt strangely and stubbornly out of sync. The people of Europe had no knowledge of the stratospheric veil that now shrouded the planet. They could not see the invisible blanket of sulfuric acid aerosols high above them, reflecting the sun's life-giving energy back into space. All they knew was that the sun seemed to have lost its power. It shone weakly from behind a persistent haze, offering little warmth. They looked to the skies for answers, but found only a strange perpetual twilight and an endless procession of dark, rain-filled clouds. Spring, it seemed, had been forgotten. May arrived, but the cold did not relent. In fact, in many places it deepened. Instead of May flowers, parts of Germany were hit with heavy frosts that killed the early fruit blossoms. The month was dominated by incessant, chilling rains and temperatures that felt more like late autumn than early summer. The sense of unease began to curdle into genuine fear. The seasons were not just late. They were broken. This was the beginning of what would come to be known in German-speaking lands as the Poverty Year, and in the English-speaking world as 1800 and froze to death. Then came June, a month that should have brought the full warmth of summer. Instead, it brought a shocking and terrifying spectacle. On June 6th, a wave of frigid Arctic air descended upon southern Quebec, Canada, and then swept across the Atlantic. In New England, it produced a summer snowstorm. Soon after, reports of the same impossible weather began to emerge from Europe. Snow was reported in parts of Hungary, and a heavy frost struck northern Italy during what should have been the heart of the growing season. The summer months of July and August offered no reprieve. The cold remained stubbornly entrenched across the continent. Rivers in Switzerland that were normally bustling with summer traffic remained frozen over in places. Ice was observed on lakes in Scotland and northern England. The average temperature in Central Europe during the summer of 1816 was a staggering 3 degrees Celsius below the norm, a deviation so extreme that it completely shattered the agricultural calendar and the expectations of daily life. The concept of summer had ceased to exist. This was a disaster of a kind that no one had ever experienced. It was not a war or a plague in the traditional sense, but a relentless, inexplicable assault by the elements. The constant, cold rain was just as destructive as the low temperatures. Fields became waterlogged, turning into muddy quagmires where crops could not grow. The endless cloud cover meant that even when the temperature did rise slightly, the plants were starved of the sunlight they needed for photosynthesis and growth. The result was a catastrophic, continent-wide failure of the harvest. In Ireland, the potato crop, the staple food for the majority of the population, rotted in the cold, wet ground. In Switzerland, the grain harvests were a near-total failure for the second year in a row, and the vineyards that climbed its hillsides produced almost no fruit. In Germany, the failure of the grain and vegetable crops was widespread, leading to a critical shortage of food as the year progressed. The breadbasket of Europe was empty. By late summer, the grim reality of the failed harvests began to set in, and the price of food started to skyrocket. The cost of grain, oats, and potatoes increased tenfold in some regions. A loaf of bread, the basic sustenance for the common person, became an unaffordable luxury. For families already living on the edge of poverty after years of war, this was a death sentence. The specter of a great famine, the likes of which had not been seen in generations, now loomed over Europe. The desperation of the starving populace soon boiled over into violence and social unrest. Food riots became a common occurrence in cities across Britain, France, and Switzerland. Marketplaces were stormed, and bakeries were looted by mobs of people desperate to feed their families. Grain wagons traveling between towns had to be protected by armed guards. The social fabric, already frayed by war, began to tear apart under the immense strain of a populace with nothing to eat and nothing left to lose. People resorted to the most desperate of measures to survive. They ate whatever they could find, foraging for weeds, roots, and moss in the barren forests. There are grim reports from Switzerland and Germany of people eating sawdust mixed with flour or consuming cats, dogs, and rats. The crisis was particularly acute in Switzerland, which was landlocked and had no port to import grain, and in Ireland, where the potato failure led to a typhus epidemic that claimed tens of thousands of lives. A great migration of the hungry began. Entire families abandoned their villages and farms, taking to the roads in a desperate search for food. These armies of beggars and vagrants moved across the landscape, their numbers swelling as they went. They were often met with hostility from towns that were already struggling to feed their own people. Governments and local charities were completely overwhelmed, unable to cope with the sheer scale of the humanitarian crisis that had descended upon them. The psychological toll was immense. Many interpreted the bleak, sunless skies and the failure of the harvest as a sign of divine punishment, a biblical apocalypse unfolding before their eyes. The lack of an obvious cause for the bizarre weather fueled superstition and fear. It felt as though the world had been fundamentally broken, that God had turned his back on humanity. A deep collective despair settled over the continent, a gloom that matched the relentless gray of the skies. This was also a crisis that struck at the very heart of the Enlightenment, which had championed reason and scientific progress. In the face of nature's inexplicable wrath, science was silent. No one could explain why the seasons had failed. No one knew that the cause was a volcano on the other side of the world. This powerlessness, in the face of an invisible atmospheric enemy, was a humbling and terrifying experience for a civilization that believed it was beginning to master the world. The cold did not break in the autumn. September and October remained cold and wet, offering no hope for a late harvest. The meager crops that had survived were stunted and poor. People faced the prospect of a long, cold winter with virtually no food reserves. The price of grain remained astronomically high, and the famine and disease continued their grim work. The year 1816 had been a continuous, unrelenting disaster from start to finish. The crisis would bleed into 1817, which also saw poor harvests in many regions as food stocks were completely depleted. The total death toll from the famine and the resulting epidemics in Europe is difficult to calculate precisely, but it is estimated that tens of thousands, perhaps even more than 100,000 people perished as a direct result of the year without a summer. It was a demographic shock that left a deep scar on the continent. The plight of Europe in 1816 is a chilling story of vulnerability. It demonstrates how completely dependent human civilization is on a stable climate and the predictable rhythm of the seasons. The suffering was made all the more poignant by the fact that its cause was entirely unknown to those who endured it. They were victims of a geological event that had occurred half a world away, its consequences delivered to them silently and invisibly by the winds of the stratosphere. Our long journey through the cold and the dark, through the shadow of a single mountain, now comes to a quiet end. The story of the 1815 eruption of Mount Tambora is one of almost unimaginable scale, a chain of consequences that linked a volcanic island in Indonesia to every corner of the globe. It is a narrative of geology, climate, famine, disease, and human history, all intertwined in a single, catastrophic event that pushed the world to its very limits. As we settle into our final thoughts, we are left with a profound and humbling lesson about the planet we call home. It began with a sound, the loudest ever recorded, as a mountain tore itself apart. It continued with pyroclastic flows that moved with the speed of an avalanche and the heat of a furnace, erasing entire kingdoms from existence in a matter of minutes. It unleashed the sea in the form of tsunamis that battered the surrounding coastlines. In the immediate vicinity of the eruption, tens of thousands of lives were extinguished in a display of raw, terrifying power that is difficult for the modern mind to fully comprehend. This was nature as an overwhelming and absolute force. But the true world-altering impact of Tambora was not in its sound or its fire. It was in the silence that followed. The eruption's most potent weapon was the immense cloud of sulfur dioxide it injected into the stratosphere. This gas, transformed into a fine mist of sulfuric acid, formed a persistent, invisible veil that shrouded the planet. This was the unseen hand of nature, a silent messenger that would carry the consequences of the eruption to every continent, an agent of chaos delivered on the high, calm winds at the edge of space. The result of this stratospheric veil was a global climate crisis of unprecedented scale. The year without a summer was not a piece of folklore, but a lived reality of snow in June in North America, of incessant chilling rains in Europe, and of disrupted, failed monsoons in Asia. The eruption demonstrated for the first time in a way that modern science can now understand that our planet is a single, interconnected system. A change in one remote part of that system can trigger a cascade of effects across the whole, ignoring all human borders and boundaries. This climatic disruption in turn unleashed a torrent of human suffering. The failure of the harvests led to a global famine, which then triggered a deep economic depression. The scarcity of food and the collapse of the economy fueled widespread social unrest, from food riots in the streets of European cities to a great, desperate migration of peoples in search of more fertile land. And on the heels of hunger came disease, as weakened populations fell victim to epidemics of typhus and a newly virulent strain of cholera that would go on to plague the world for a century. The story of Tambora serves as a chilling and essential reminder of nature's raw, uncompromising power. In 1815, humanity was focused on its own conflicts. The great powers of Europe were consumed by the final act of the Napoleonic Wars, a struggle between emperors and armies that seemed to be the most important event of the age. Yet a single geological event thousands of miles away unleashed a force that dwarfed the power of any army and had a far more profound and lasting impact on the course of human history. It is a lesson in humility. It reminds us that for all our ambition and ingenuity, our civilizations are built upon a thin, fragile crust of Earth, and under the assumption of a stable climate we have no control over. The greatest threats to our existence may not always come from the conflicts we wage against each other, but from the immense and impersonal forces of the planet itself. Forces that can be carried on the wind, silent and invisible, altering our world with the mere whisper of ash. So, as you drift towards sleep tonight, take a moment to be grateful for the simple things that the people of 1816 so desperately longed for. Be grateful for the predictable turning of the seasons, for a spring that arrives with warmth, and for a summer that brings growth. Be grateful for a sun that rises each morning, not as a pale, distant disk, but as a reliable source of life and energy. The world of Tambora reminds us that this stability is not a given, it is a precious gift. Thank you for listening to our long tale tonight. May your rest be deep and untroubled, and may your dreams be filled with the pleasant and reassuring images of warm sun, gentle rains, and bountiful harvests. Sleep well.